Hello, everyone. Welcome. Um, for those in Asia, good night, and for those in North America, good morning, and for those in India, good evening. I am Bernard Yang, President of ABFEL. Welcome to the third of the series on post-pandemic driving inclusive growth in Asia. Last winter, ABFEL Senior Fellow Asim Khawaja and Tyrone Kana, Randall Mock, and we discussed the deep challenges amid the pandemic, especially among the less privileged and in less well-to-do countries in our region. We want to do something to draw people's attention to the situation, not just the negative, but also we want to hear the positive side. We want to explore, identify and explore the hopes, and we also want to elicit some research efforts. This led to a series of webinars hosted by ABFDL, Harvard CID, and Mittel Institute. The first panel was on January 19th, focusing on education. The second one focused on healthcare. Today, our panel focused on economic and social policies driving social cohesion in Asia. We were very blessed to Professor Danny Quah, the Lee Ka-shing Professor of Economics and Dean of the LKY School of Public Policy, to chair the panel. We have a very distinguished and knowledgeable panel. Our panel members include Ms. Maraj Chatterjee, Director of Social Security Self-Employment Women's Association, and Dr. Jonathan Ostrey, Deputy Director of the Asia and Pacific Department at the IMF, and Professor Jin Yang, Provost Chair Professor in NUS Sociology Department and Founding Director of the Center for Family and Population Research. I'm very eager to learn from Danny and the panelists. So without further ado, let me just right now pass the mic to you. Danny, please take us forward.
Thank you very much, Bernard, and good day to everyone joining this webinar. It is part of a series. This webinar today is going to be about post-pandemic policies driving social cohesion. We have a wonderful panel and I want to get to them as quickly as possible, but I've also been given a job to take a couple of minutes to set the stage for what we're going to go into. And in setting the stage, I might try to be a little bit more provocative than I normally am, just to get the conversation sparked. So there are two things I want to say. One, I want to try and give a sense of what social cohesion, social unrest, social discord around the world has been like before, during, and after the pandemic. And then I want to actually try and drill down to how the COVID pandemic has added to this narrative beyond just a sequence in time. So social unrest around the world, that's as good a place to begin as anything. Over this last year, a number of us on this panel have been involved in the 2022 World Economic Forum Global Risks Investigation. This team surveyed the world, and they found that next to the global climate crisis, looking forwards, the erosion of social cohesion is the lead driver for perceptions of global risks in the short to medium term. This is big time if we're thinking about a stable global environment going forwards. When we look across this history, this recent history, we look at COVID, the COVID episode, and we realize it is hugely significant. But I also want to put on the record as we begin the conversation, it's not been everything. Social unrest, however you count it, total number of anti-government demonstrations, riots, strikes, newspaper accounts, media tallies, social unrest has been on a sharp rise through all the decades of well, not through all the decades, let me restate that, through the decade of the 2010s, across all nations in the world. And through the decade of the 2010s, significantly, that includes a huge chunk of the pre-COVID recent world history. Now, by this measure, global unrest by 2020, the beginning of the pandemic, had already reached 4 times its previous average, an average level that by comparison has been remarkably stable for the last 5-6 decades. We know, therefore, that across geographies, across political systems, social unrest has been on the rise, and it's been on the rise even before the COVID pandemic. Now, when we look at this and we think about what's happening within nations, we think of populism. We think about the terrible things that are happening in democracies around the world. When we look across nations rather than within them, we think of geopolitical rivalry. And we think of inequality. Inequality is often tagged as the principal conduit for this social discord. People write things like the weak and vulnerable in all of societies lack hope. They lack purpose. They're looking for dignity. And they watch from society's sidelines as they look at others pulling ahead to ever greater prosperity. Now, to add to all of this, and remember, this is all happening even before COVID, the pandemic has not helped. We've all read accounts of how the richer in societies, with their fast Wi-Fi, their remote teleworking, their stock market heavy financial portfolios have all just gotten richer over COVID pandemic. While the poorer, manual labor jobs have been shut down, unable to commute because of the risk to public health, stuck at home with no pay, children unable to attend schools, either physically or remotely, have had their positions become ever more precarious. There is no question inequality has worsened with COVID. But is inequality the cause of the predicament of the poor? When someone loses their manual labor job, is unable to go find work, doesn't have fast Wi-Fi, good computers for their kids, it is because they are specialized in work that's now unavailable. It is because they are poor. It is because they are deprived of resources. And let me advance the conjecture. It is not because someone the next street over is rich. It is not because of inequality. We need to distinguish inequality as a result of COVID from inequality being a conduit and a cause for greater human suffering. So that is a background with which I come into this conversation. I now look to the panelists to adjust and recalibrate all of our views on this. And I'm going to ask them to help us unpack these issues. I'm not going to reintroduce everyone the way that Bernard's already done that, but I'm just going to go through each of the panelists in alphabetical order by last name, if that's okay. So Mirai, may I hand over to you now? You have 7 minutes. Make your case.
Thanks very much, Bernard. And I'm very happy to be here representing the Self-Employed Women's Association, which is the largest union of women workers in the informal economy in India. And as many of you would know, more than 90% of the Indian workforce is informal. And more than 94% of the female Indian workforce is informal. So it's almost everybody. And as you can all well imagine, they have borne the brunt of the pandemic. I thought I would mention a few gaps that it's a view from the ground, if you will, from the grassroots, a micro view. One is that we did see, speaking of social and economic policy, we did see our government swing into action, bringing in certain welfare measures to close the gap of inequality. The most urgent need, of course, was food, because we are a country that is often a hungry country. So the public distribution system seems to be one of the welfare measures that really did quite well. We have seen greater investments in healthcare, cash transfers to women, housing. But as everything with many of countries of Asia and certainly mine, the implementation and the reach to the last mile has been uneven at best, with the poorest and those who are not organized into their own unions and cooperatives and collectives hardly getting a look in. I think the other positive aspect, which is closing the gap, is digitalization. There have been, I would say, substantial gains, but there also continues to be a digital divide, particularly a gender digital divide. We find among SEWA members who are all informal women workers that often they did not have the device. The device was in the hand of the male in the family. And it has been very difficult for their children to continue with school. Now, this has been well documented. Another issue that has come up, which is keeping the gap open, I should say, is the lack of working capital for the nano and tiny micro enterprises that most of informal women workers and informal workers are engaged with. And finally, another major gap, which I think has not come out, is that many women in Asia, and certainly in South Asia, which I know best, and India, cannot go back to work, have not been able to go back to work till very recently because of lack of childcare support. A lot of the government childcare centers in India only recently opened after 2 years. I'd like to end by a few other positives, if I may, Bernard, which have come out from our own studies of the SEWA Cooperative Federation. On the one hand, we saw that 80 to 90% of our members reported financial stress and loss of livelihood. 85% said they couldn't go back to work because of lack of childcare, but 71% of them said they survived because of their cooperatives and collectives. They were able to pivot, they were able to take advantage of certain opportunities like mask making and sanitizer and soap making and so on. So I would like to suggest that if we want to develop policies that will help us rebuild and build resilience for the poorest and most vulnerable of our continent, then first of all, we need to invest in membership-based organizations and collective businesses, collective enterprises, particularly those run by women. We've had some good experience when the UK cooperative movement and some private capital invested, and we're talking about really small investments here. We're talking about investments to the tune of $4,000 to $6,000 US that make all the difference between survival and collapse of women's collective enterprises. The second is cash transfers. The cash transfer just of $130 US would make all the difference for micro entrepreneurs. I guess I'm making the case slowly, as you can guess, that if we want to rebuild our economies and societies and in a less unequal manner, then we have to build from bottom up. That has been the experience of India. And then also, we now have to move quickly towards universal healthcare, universal social protection. We look at some of our Asian sisters and brothers with envy. We still have a long way to go. The government is now trying to register informal workers through a portal which we call eShram. The government has now realized that the one sector that survived in India, the pandemic, was the rural economy, agriculture, farms. People went back to the land. So it's high time we invested more in the rural economy, on farm and off farm, address the digital divide, as I've mentioned. And finally, a ray of hope is that we have a new ministry, a ministry of cooperation, because it has become official Government of India policy that we'll only be able to build back better together if we focus on micro enterprises like cooperatives. And then we will go towards what we in India call Atmanirbhar Bharat, self-reliant India. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mirai, for a very powerful statement on how so much of the Indian economy is informal, how one needs to invest bottom up to raise the very bottom of the income distribution, and how a lot of that is both rural and needs to occur in small collective groups. Thank you again for that very powerful statement. Let me turn to Jonathan, if I may. Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Danny. Let me share my screen because I have a few slides. Let's see if this works. Okay, good. You know, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Danny and to Bernard for including me in this panel. My 7 minutes is going to actually mirror what what Danny said, and I'm sure we'll come back to some of these issues in the discussion. So in a nutshell, I'm going to echo what Danny said, which is that things were getting worse before the pandemic. The pandemic then came upon us and made things worse still. As economic researchers and policymakers, we can try and draw inferences about the future of events like this pandemic from historical data on past pandemics, and they point in an unfavorable direction. And then we can ask whether history is necessarily destiny and what the role of policy is at the end of the day. So as I was saying, I had 2 stints working on Asia in my career. One long before many of you were born, I suspect, in the 80s and 90s. And I sort of then left Asia and returned 3 years ago to start working on Asia again. And I must say it's a different world from what I remembered. And I had to unlearn what I had learned decades ago, which is that there was this growth with equity model, and everyone pretty much was sharing in the rapidly expanding pie. That was true in the earlier vintage, but it has not been true, and you see it in rising inequality. And we'll come back to Danny's point, whether this is a sufficient statistic for anything else, whether it's causal. And you also see it in the growth incidence curves, which have, whether you're talking about income or consumption, have deteriorated markedly in recent times relative to the earlier period. You see that Asia is not a poster child for gender equity. When you compare it across the world, it is not a poster child for including youth and having youth that is not marginalized. Quite to the contrary. It is not a poster child, and maybe it shouldn't be, for people in formal employment. Quite to the contrary, as the previous speaker just said. And it is not a poster child for a redistributive welfare state, weak social safety nets, et cetera, and maybe it shouldn't be, but these are facts. It is not a poster child. It has not been a poster child for equality of opportunity. So I've said something about equality of outcomes, but the point is that those at the bottom do not have good access to education. They do not have good access to health. They do not have good access to finance. So these are not recipes for getting those at the bottom to do better in the future. So what has the pandemic done to all this? Well, we know that there was an epic proportion decline in labor force participation. We know that youth has been affected more than anybody else, and we know that women have been done very badly during this pandemic, again, as the previous speaker indicated. What we have done in some companion work is try and draw different inferences from past data on pandemics about what might happen to inequality and other indicators of cohesion, of risks to social unrest, and so forth. And what we find is that pandemics are a good indicator of rising inequality to a level that is of concern. And you see it whether we're talking about income shares or the Gini. You see it whether you're talking about risks to job loss for those with basic education versus those that have higher education. You see it in risks to falling into informality and self-employment. And you see it in risks to social unrest. And Danny spoke a lot about this. And I would say that there is a higher risk of social unrest from events of this kind. And it is particularly pernicious, so it's not linear, when inequality is already high to a level that we actually see in many Asian countries. What can policy do to counteract the make history not destiny? We know that fiscal policy was highly effective when it was deployed vigorously during this pandemic, and that is a key message. You need lifelines and you need demand support at different stages of the pandemic. We know that the impacts on all social indicators are more favorable when fiscal policy is generous relative to when it is austere, and you see that in the fiscal balance or on health expenditure. And you also know that crises in general, and pandemics are no exception, are an opportunity to reform and grow the pie. And reforms can grow the pie, and you see this across a variety of indicators, but you have to be careful to do the reforms right, to make sure that the losers don't get such short shrift in the reform process that they oppose pie increasing benefits that can improve the welfare of all, potentially. And you have to pay attention to the politics, because reforms on the eve of elections, because of the delays in growing the pie, but the impact on the losers short term can short circuit the reform effort. So, these are my main points. There's a picture here to sort of encapsulate them, but I'd like to stop here and thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Wonderful, wonderful presentation on how you took us through what the previous historical trend was, how COVID has exacerbated so many of these indicators, and how I think one of the very powerful messages I want to make sure our audience engages with as we go forwards. Sometimes there is an almost triumphalist talk of Asia rising. Asia has arrived. And what you've shown us is that, yes, the world's economic center of gravity might have shifted towards Asia, but Asia is no poster child for how it has failed to be inclusive in its growth experience, and it has failed many significant segments of Asian society. I hope very much we come back to that in our discussion. I know Jean is going to have some really interesting things to say about this, so I'm going to hand over to Jean at this point. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Danny, and thank you, Bernard, for including me. Let me share my screen first. Are you able to see this?
Yep, see it clearly.
Yeah. Okay, so social cohesion has been defined in many different ways. I think for tonight's purpose, it's appropriate to define cohesive society as characterized by resilient social relations, a positive emotional connectedness between its members, and a community and a pronounced focus on common good. OECD also uses along this line to say a cohesive society strives for social integration and inclusion, builds social capital to create a sense of belonging, and promotes trust and offers its member the opportunity for upward mobility. I think that's important to know. The barriers for social cohesions, as we have been talking about, the cleavage along the line of socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, gender, age, and political parties, those can all undermine the social cohesion. I would like to add a few more things, and this by no means is an exhaustive list. The change of family systems in the past at least half a century, the decline in family size, the decline in marriage, rise in one-person household and childlessness, an increase in divorces. These are potentially weaken the social cohesion. For many people, the most important and significant social relations and embeddedness is through family. And in Asia, in Japan and Korea, about 30% of the household only have one person. And in Singapore, for example, 1 in 4 of the women aged 50 is childless, and most never married. Next, I would like to say the increase in migration, both in internal migration and international migration. For example, in China, because of the household hukou system, the rural-urban to urban migrants are excluded in many ways to participate fully in the economic and social lives. And in Singapore, 40% of the total annual marriages actually consist of one citizen marrying one foreigners. And the research has shown that such families have lower social capital and are less well integrated. And finally, technology and social media, and this is a double-edged sword. The media can increase your social network, and it could also make you more isolated, connected to only people like yourself. And this could have the potential of increasing the polarization. And the fake news, of course, does not help either. The COVID-19, we've already been shown that it has very uneven impact of household and individual, and exacerbated the existing inequality. The most vulnerable groups are women, older adults, youth, children, racial minority groups, and migrants that some our speakers have talked about, and I don't have time to elaborate on. Those who have more human capital, social capital, and wealth can cope better because these resources can help buffer the impact of multiple external shocks and help them to bounce back. I want to share with you some of the data that we've collected in Singapore longitudinal early development on families with young children. We've collected data once before the COVID-19 and once after the COVID-19. And I will show you how COVID-19 has impacted these families. The first slide shows that the most disadvantaged are harder hit during the pandemics. And here you can see the employment and income change situations by people who live in different kind of housing status, from the most disadvantaged of people who live in rental public housing to those who are living in increasingly large units, and finally to those who live in condos and private landed properties. So you can see the most disadvantaged groups have much higher propensity of losing jobs, changing jobs, and a large proportion of them actually reported moderate decrease or severe decrease of income changes. And in one of the richest country in the world, and certainly in Asia, 17% of those who live in this disadvantaged group actually reported they're having trouble making ends meet. And you can see here that disadvantaged groups had to, more of them had to cut down on their spending on essential items or to borrow monies from government, friends, or families compared to the other groups. Here you can see that low SES segment experienced more food insecurity and were less likely to have savings. And here you see that the lowest income groups actually have more people in Singapore. Imagine that they're worried about the food level in their household because they don't have money to buy more. And more than half of the households actually don't have savings of 1 month of family income. And again, I would remind you that this is Singapore that we're talking about. Here we show that home-based learning disadvantaged children in low disadvantaged groups too. 12% of the kids in those who live in the rental housing actually did not have a computer or tablet that they can use for homework or home-based learning. And children have, 18% of them don't have a quiet place to study, and much fewer of the, much more of those who live in private housing, large condos and landed properties, participate in extra online tutorial classes during the circuit breaker period. This is before pandemic. We just talked about before pandemic, a lot of the existing inequalities were there already. And here we show that for very young children at age of 4 to 6, in their test scores, there are very large discrepancies on their math scores and verbal scores already. These are Z scores. And we showed it for lowest income quartile to highest income quartile. You could see the clear gradients, and between the lowest and the highest income group, there's the difference of more than 1 standard deviation, 1.2 standard deviation actually. This large difference, we think after the pandemic is going to become even larger. And this is something we can check after our data are ready. And the most disadvantaged children would lag further behind. This would potentially create a vicious cycle of intergenerational transmission of disadvantages. and this is not conducive for upward social mobility. How about family relations? We show that pandemic actually did not worsen for most Singaporean families amid COVID-19. More families says that their family members got along better than those who says they got worse. The quality of communication between family members got better too, and most families says they have more time to spend as a family. Cohesion in Singapore looks fairly healthy. More than half of these families says they have fairly strong and very strong sense of belonging to their neighbors. And a majority of them do have high trust to their neighbors. And of course, we see 3 to 5% of the families are less engaged, and that's a cause of concern. So Singapore is the way it is today, mainly due to a lot of the effort that the government had put in place already before the pandemic, and then beef up during the pandemic time. Including the public housing policies, healthcare, expanded education to inclusive population, and most recently, the lifelong learning that the government had been promoting to enhance this early childhood education to promote social mobility in the population. Also, minimize racial segregation, a strong emphasis on rule of law, strong support for family and community building, and also strong collaboration between government, community, and private companies. And yet we have seen still the COVID-19 revealed disparities by SES gender citizenship that we don't have time to talk about today, but that remains great concerns that need greater efforts to address. So I will stop there since my time is up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you for that very interesting re-emphasis on sociological aspects to the challenge here. Rightly, you took us through social cohesion and how it is, all the different characteristics and features to think about this. So let me begin our conversation by maybe building on what you said, Jean, but I want Jonathan and Mirai to come in on this as well. Okay, so I'm going to be maybe a little bit mischievous and be a little bit of a devil's advocate. And so, Jean, you've shown us that the vulnerable in society are vulnerable. You've shown us that the poorer people worry about not having enough savings. It is the weak and disadvantaged to worry about whether they're going to have food on their table. It is the less advantaged groups who are most likely to run into financial difficulties. How is this different? How is COVID making things different? A lot of your discussion has been about Singapore, but it seems to me that what you've described about how the vulnerable are going to have challenges is true everywhere. What is it that's special about the COVID experience or about Asia that makes your analysis particularly resonant? And I want to use that idea to also maybe challenge both Jonathan and Mirai in what they're suggesting in terms of how Asia has not performed well for Jonathan, and how Mirai feels that so much of the Indian policies need to be focused the way they have. So Jean, first you. So you've shown us that the vulnerable are vulnerable. So what?
Yeah, I think what we're showing is that, in one of the richest country in the world, in Singapore, that looks on the surface may look all nice. Everyone has enough food to eat and good housing and so on. And when we look deeper, there's a small segments of these population, those who live in rental housing or 1 to 2 room housing. That's 6% or 10% of these total population still on daily basis are experience these vulnerability.
Okay. Let me ask you the following question. Take these people, the ones who you've described fall into a certain group. Their level of income is lower than the average level of income in Singapore. does that mean that they are worse off because they live in Singapore at that average level of income? If they had the same level of income and they lived in India, say, or Cambodia, would they also suffer these disadvantages? It seems to me that they would. Are you making the argument that they are not, that it's somehow different because they live in Singapore?
No, I don't think I'm saying that. I'm saying every society has their system to deal with, and they have different policies. And we know that Singapore has high income level, but their income inequality is higher than many of the Asian countries or even the Western countries. So every country needs to look at what their vulnerability and the cracks in their social safety net is and address those issues.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Jean. But and let me also point out that whatever the level of Singapore's inequality might be, the fact is that its bottom 50% have seen their incomes rise faster than the incomes of even some of the richer people elsewhere in the world. It doesn't seem to me very helpful to say that because Singapore's inequality might be high, therefore this is a challenge, because it seems to me that if it is the weak and vulnerable that need assistance, we should be focused on the weak and vulnerable, not on whether Singapore's inequality is high, not on what happens to the average income in Singapore. Do you agree with that?
I actually am not sure I understand your point. I think you identify the vulnerability and you address them. We should not deny that inequality is high, and that is, to me, is a problem.
Okay.
At the end, I showed that the social cohesion is pretty healthy, and the people's relationship and trust to the institution is high. And that is because of a lot of the policies that Singapore has put in place for everybody, for everybody. And so despite there's challenges of this, the government and communities and business come together to do help people out. But
Okay.
COVID-19 has definitely shown that this is not a perfect picture, and
Okay.
we should not deny there's a high inequality.
Yeah, but okay, let's come back to this, because as you say, there are different sides to this. But what you've just said leads me to wanting to ask the same question to Mirai, because Mirai pointed out to us that 90% of India's working population is informal, is rural. So a lot of people are not very well paid. Inequality in that group is not necessarily high, but your policies are targeting, what you want to do is to target the weak and vulnerable specifically, investing in their organizations, investing in collective groups to help raise the bottom of the income distribution. And that seems to me like, very well targeted, very specific. How have you seen these kinds of policies work out in light of some of the political economy challenges that Jonathan pointed out, and that I want to turn to Jonathan in a minute? Mirai.
Well, if I understood the question, Bernard, yes, it's true that we have a large informal workforce. And of course, the majority are self-employed. They don't have jobs. They don't have any fixed employee relations. They basically depend on their own wits and strength and courage for survival. And we saw this again during the pandemic. So a couple of points. I mean, they may be poor and vulnerable, but we find, and particularly women, they are extremely economically active. The informal economy contributes more than 50% to India's GDP and growth story. And yet we have a long way to go, I'm sorry to say, to close the gap. And one of the things that, when I was listening to Jean, I was struck that, the kind of data that you shared, Jean, mirrors very much what our micro studies show. Exactly the same patterns. But I think another really important lesson that we've learned during the pandemic is not only are the poor economically active, so it's it makes sense to invest in these kind of nano and tiny enterprises, but also there is a lot of solidarity and cohesion. During the pandemic, and even before, but during the pandemic, when it was virtually impossible for our government to deal with the massive problem that we had of the pandemic, especially after the second wave, it was people who came together. And the biggest lesson that we have at SEWA to share with the world is the importance of solidarity and unity and social cohesion. Ours is a tiny micro story in a country of 1.3 billion, but still it shows the way forward, which is that if you build social capital in peacetime, if I may put it that way, it goes a long way in times of distress and stress. So those are some of the important things that we learned. And, we know what to do. Why don't we do it? Why don't we have Jonathan and the World Bank? I know you can't because of the way you're structured, but who is going to invest in these women who are already so economically active? Who is going to invest in the farmers of India who were, as you all know, on the streets for more than a year, defending their rights and saying that we're ready to feed the country, but we want policies that are inclusive, that at least are consultative for a start. So these are some of the things that, are not necessarily a direct outcome of the pandemic, but during the pandemic, all of these issues bubbled up to the fore. Some positive and some not so positive. So I think plenty of lessons for the way forward. We know what we need to do, but we have to do it.
Thank you so much for that. Mary, those are wonderful vignettes that you've described to us, how local communities have come together to help each other, and that social capital, social cohesion is something that builds on itself, that is a gift that continues to benefit society.
Sorry, if I may just jump in, it's not just social capital among the poor. I should have also mentioned that, higher income groups in India, we have a tradition of what we call Annadan, which is supporting with food, because we've always been a hungry country. And, even in my own neighborhood, each of us, cooked food and fed migrants. That's just, and it wasn't just one or two households, it was entire neighborhoods, and the local elected councillors collected the food and made sure that no one starved. I mean, this was all citizen effort.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. Jonathan, if I can turn to you to get your view. I mean, we've heard really interesting descriptions of how two different Asian economies have tried to navigate this quite treacherous landscape of growth and inclusiveness and cohesion. And of course, and you've shown us a great deal of data as well on this. I wonder how you think your analysis from where you sit of what Asia has done squares with the stories that Jean and Mirai have told us.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Danny. I want to, a couple of things have been said that I want to clarify. I think, Danny, you kind of encapsulated my thing as sort of Asia's not done well. I certainly didn't mean that at all. I think Asia is the envy of the world in so many ways, and its growth model actually is one of them. What I was pointing out is that the growth model seems to have shifted a little bit in between my two stints in working on this region. And I also want to, I thought Mirai's point, we know what we need to do, we just need to do it, is perhaps the most important point that needs to be said. And it resonated with me because in the first year of the pandemic, if you read the Financial Times or the Economist magazine, you saw the world's billionaires write editorials, and you saw op-eds, and you saw the actual editorial pages of these mainline publications sort of say that the pandemic has to change how we do things in society. And they're basically saying what Mirai was saying. And the issue for me is words are one thing and actions are another. And I think what the history shows us, and I think the words are different this time, they are different. And the actions have been different. In other words, fiscal support has been unprecedented. There has been more cooperation at the global level than in past episodes that have admittedly not been severe. So things have been different for the better. But I think what we have seen, what history tells us is that when the pandemic or events like this recede, these wonderful words get forgotten, and the follow through is not there. And you know, if you look at my chart on inequality, what they show is that it's not something that happens and goes away. It actually gets worse over the medium term. These pernicious effects build on one another. They don't die out. And so if you look at the broad sweep, we see a ratchet effect, you know, from the Great Recession or the pandemic or other seismic events where these things sort of build on each other. And I think that speaks to me that what Mirai said had to happen to do it doesn't actually happen. And I think this, you have to ask why it doesn't happen. And I think, Danny, you won't like this, but one reason it might not happen is because of inequality. Because inequality is not just inequality of incomes. It is also inequality of power, of politics, of the voice of those at the bottom that doesn't get heard. And so I think, you know, I'm not unsympathetic, Danny, to your viewpoint that inequality, the Gini, is not the only thing we should focus on. But it doesn't mean that we should not focus on it at all. And the issue, Danny, you said, the bottom half are doing better, and that's great. And it's not the business of anybody on this panel to say whether societies should worry about the Gini, the growth incidence curve, the bottom 50%, the bottom 20%, the middle class. That is a social contract issue that we have nothing to say about. Each society, what India wants to do is not the same thing as what Sweden wants to do and what the United States want to do, or Singapore. Those are all different, and there'll be different social contracts. But I think we have to recognize that there is a correlation amongst all of these things. And the bottom line is that the disenfranchised, those at the bottom, suffer more, as you say, and their voice doesn't carry a lot of weight. And that's why there isn't the follow through that Mirai says needs to happen. I stop there.
Okay, thank you. Really interesting views from the three of you. I have a question from a member of the audience that follows up on each of the points that you've made, and it touches on the inequality point that Jonathan made so powerfully. It touches on the Singapore situation that Jean talked about, and it touches on the self-help and social cohesion work that Mirai described so powerfully for us happening in India. And this question from Lee Kuan Yew School student Evangeline Tan, and she points out that according to some statistics, income inequality in Singapore actually fell to a historic low in 2020 because of the kind of fiscal assistance that the Singapore government provided. So this touches Jean on a number of things that you said, and it's also in counterpoint, Mirai, to some of the Indian experiences you described. But the student then goes on to say, my question is that this dip in income inequality fell because of massive transfers from the government, because of budget packages that were intended to help the weak and vulnerable. So the point is, how much of this is going to be sustainable? Because as the COVID pandemic wears away and we're no longer so driven, as a society to use society's resources in that way. Can we take from this experience some of the policies that might be more sustained, that would keep the social fabric tight, Jonathan, in a way that you and I would agree on, that would continue the good work that Mirai has described, and that would touch on, Jean, some of the tensions that you so vividly portrayed for us. Maybe I can begin with you, Mirai, because your experience in India, of course, has helped us think about a counterpoint to the fiscal infusion that we saw here in Singapore and that the students described in her question. Mirai, over to you, please.
So, I just want to say I really, what Jonathan said really resonated with me. And, again, I go to the farmers' protest because it's a link with social unrest, although it was, for the most part, a peaceful and nonviolent protest that was supported by by millions of citizens across the country. I think the big lesson is that if you have no voice and representation, the only other avenue is, being out on the streets, quite frankly, and making your presence and your voice heard. So what we at SEWA call organizing, which is building solidarity for constructive action, as Mahatma Gandhi taught us, but also raising our voice against injustice. If the policies are, in fact, widening the gap, inequality gap. So I don't know if I understood your point correctly, but I think that is one of the lessons that we've learned, that it is about organizing, it is about representation and voice. And fortunately, in democratic societies, we are in a position to exercise our democratic rights and be there and make sure our voices are heard. But that doesn't mean it's necessarily converted into social policies. We've learned all these years that it takes sustained action at the grassroots, because after all, we are also voters. So sustained action at the grassroots, coupled with, pushing for policies and legislation. And this is a marathon. It's long-term. Our struggle for the rights of street vendors in India took us 40 years. Took us 40 years to get a law passed in the Indian Parliament. So we really can't give up. We have to keep on keeping on if we have to close that inequality gap. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that very inspiring statement, Mirai. Really beautiful to hear you describe this. Jean, if I can turn to you now before I come back to Jonathan. The question that came from Evangeline had to do specifically with what you described, Jean, in terms of the disparities. I mean, what you refer to as obviously the income inequality that we saw in Singapore. And the question was, there's a way to sort of patch over that income inequality challenge through these fiscal transfers. But the Evangeline very appropriately asked, we need to think about sustainable kinds of changes. It can't be just a one-time fix that then goes away when the worst ravages of the pandemic goes away. And so how do you see, given the experience that we've just gone through, so patching up the problem that you've identified in terms of this inequality, even in rich societies challenge?
Right. So yes, I agree that Singapore is fortunate to have this large reserve to do this large cash transfer to people, to save people from this large crisis. And it's, of course, not possible for a lot of countries and not sustainable even in Singapore. I think to address inequality, there are long-term and short-term policies that we can think about. And there's also, child-based policy or parent-based policy or community-based policy that we could think about that gets quite complicated. But I think we have to address the most urgent one in the short term. situations like food insecurity for young children, family with young children, is just not acceptable. It's not acceptable because it need not happen in a food heaven country like Singapore. So we have to make sure that we address that, not just during pandemic, but everyday life without pandemic too. That is something that the COVID has exposed to us. Healthcare is very important. The digital divide is very important because kids don't have Wi-Fi or a laptop to do their homework. That's not going to work. And again, here, Singapore came very quickly to fix that. In our wave one, we found that about 12% of those who live in rental housing did not have Wi-Fi connection. During pandemic, actually, we know that government had made great effort, and we found that 97% of the household have in the rental housing has connection already. So that's a huge effort. There's still about 3% that don't have that. So these kind of short-term needs to be definitely, short-term immediately met. In the long term, I think there's the issue of, the working poor, people who are working in long hours, but no security and very low wages. These are very urgent issues to deal with. And I think, again, government has started to handle some of this, but this is high priority. But the longest term solution, I think, is in education and in training, reskilling people and training for new skills that the market needs. This is going to have the biggest payoff in the long run. But, as I say, there are short-term and long-term things that we need to pay attention to.
Yeah, thank you, Jean. Before I hand over to Jonathan to get his views on this general topic, I just thought to say, Jean, I mean, I'm quite struck by a difference between your description of the challenge and what it takes to fix that, and Mirai's. I mean, I'm not trying to artificially cause dissent in my panel or anything, but but Jean, you do make constant reference to the government coming in to fix this or to fix that. And the truth is the government has done a lot for all the things that you've mentioned, changed Wi-Fi accessibility, totally transformed the way in which the landscape of work was carried out over the course of the pandemic, and very, very quickly drawing on resources that have been accumulated over time. And that's the Singapore story. And compared to a situation where it was self-help, organically grown from the grassroots. And it's quite interesting to hear that contrast, that different societies come up with different social compacts by which they figure out how to take the best way forwards. One of the nice things about this conversation is how we have to acknowledge that what's happened in one society needs to be compared and contrasted with how different societies have had to handle this. And going back to something very powerful that Jonathan said, which is that different societies have written different social compacts. And we cannot look at we cannot look at criticizing sides of this in isolation without acknowledging that this is part of the social contract that's been written, and it's different from how different societies are managing this. One of the things I take away from a very small economy and a very large nation in Asia, such an interesting contrast in how we're coming through the pandemic, building economic and social policies going forwards for improved social cohesion. Jonathan, I want to give you the last word in this thinking about economic and social policies. And I particularly want to do that because in light of what we've just been discussing, your presentation ended very intriguingly with how there might be political economy challenges if we don't proceed carefully, because inequality throws up unexpected challenges to us. I agree with you on this. I don't want to be characterized as disagreeing with you, but I'd like to see you flesh that out a little bit more. And then we're going to have to end, and I'll head back to Bernard.
Okay, thank you, Danny. I'll address your point, and I'm going to make two others very quickly because we're out of time. The first and important point is that I've learned an incredible amount from Jean, from Mirai, and from you, Danny, in this call. I thought it was an excellent discussion, and I really want to thank you and Bernard for organizing this. Second point. Now, what was my second point? Well, I'll get to the, oh no, so yeah, the second point was the question about sustainable fiscal policy. I really want to come back to that because of course, everyone has to pay attention to the sustainability of fiscal transfers and fiscal support. We learned in this crisis that we had more fiscal space than we thought we had. And even countries like India that are not on the right tail of the most generous fiscally learned, and we all learned together, they had more fiscal space and could do more. And we saw that rich countries were able to do much more than poor countries, and middle-income countries were in the middle, but I think my impression is that this was a crisis that showed the value of fiscal support and largely was provided. What we also know is that from the global financial crisis there and others is that turning off the fiscal tap prematurely is self-defeating. So we had a very weak recovery globally after the global financial crisis, and fiscal policy has to shoulder a big part of that blame. So, what I mean by self-defeating is that you turn off the tap too soon, you have a weaker and more anemic recovery, and then in the end, a greater debt buildup because of the denominator of the debt ratio rather than the numerator. So that's my second point. My last one is political economy, you asked. All I meant is that there are two things driving the sustainability, there may be more, of reforms that increase the pie. One is the business cycle. I mean, reforms are tougher to enact and sustain in bad times, but we also know that bad times are often a catalyst for reforms because crises provide opportunities. So there's a bit of that tension. There is the issue that there are winners and losers from reform, and the design of reform cannot turn a blind eye to the losers because otherwise they can become vocal and they can undo reforms that will grow the pie for everybody, and with appropriate redistribution can make everybody better off. And the third is the political cycle, that reforms where the benefits are delayed but the costs are short-term, done on the eve of an election, turn out to be less sustainable because the incumbent who's trying to do this loses voter share and loses their job. So let me just stop there. Those were the points I wanted to
really interesting. Thank you so much, Jonathan, and thank you, Jean and Mirai, for such wonderful interventions. I just learned such a huge amount from this last hour of conversation with the three of you. Let me head back to Bernard now, who will close us out.
Well, thank you, Danny, and thank you all my respected panelists. I learned a huge amount in this conversation. I want to thank you, and I want you to forgive me for taking a bit of time to just round this up. When we started this, we worry about this COVID stuff. And this conversation that you just did helped us in the following way. We recognize that Asia has been doing well, but there exists a lot of inequality and social cohesion issues that we must pay attention to. The second thing is that the COVID exposed to us many of these issues that we may not pay enough attention to before, and now we see a lot more. And we worry about that this will lead to some long-term scarring effect. That's really a concern. At the same time, the good news is that people are self-reliant. They are very resourceful. The positive news is that they turn people more in a micro sense together. The family get more together, neighborhood get more together, and we try to counter all these problems. So for me, it's like, let's think about the positive. First, as I hear from the panelists, we really need to generate sustained representation. It's not a one-shot deal. We have to represent all the groups as much as we can, whatever the social contract is, but everyone deserves some attention. Number two is the policy need to be coordinated. There will be short and long-term policies, and there could be more effective policies, there could be less effective policies. And here's where the research community, including my colleagues in the Lee Kuan Yew School, come on, let's get together. There exists a lot of micro-level policy issues that we can make our policy more efficient, more effective. Then I really love the point that it's not a one-shot deal. Policies and the thinking of all this need to be sustained. It is not about, it's over, then we're done. If it's over, it's done, your patient may not be able to walk and collapse and break the leg again. That's what I really worry about. So this is a marathon, citing what Miraj has said. Then one more point I want to add, and I'm looking at your picture, Miraj. The private sector, there should be a call to action by the private sector. One of our original motivation in organizing this is that we want to stimulate research, and we also want to call to attention to the private sector, because there's so much they can do at each neighborhood. And it's not just the government, but we are thinking about the market, the state, and the community all coming together. And at the end, I hope that out of this lesson, we all can get to a better future. And for that, I want to thank Danny. I want to thank Miraj. I want to thank Jonathan. I want to thank Jean. It's a wonderful discussion, a wonderful session. I learned a lot. And also I want to thank my collaborators in the CID in the Mittal Institute. This series of things really, really are very educational, and we hope that we're able to write something up to capture the wonderful conversations we had. Thank you very much, and thanks for tolerating me for going over time. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And thanks to the audience for staying with us all this time. Thank you. Good
Thanks,
night.
everyone.
Good morning.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Have a good rest of the day. Bye.